Hey, if you've been following the news at all recently, you've probably been hearing about the Southern Baptist Convention and the big scandal over these last couple of years. And I finally took some time to take a look at the report that came out. I want to talk about that briefly in today's video as we cover the Southern Baptists and this particular scandal. And you can read the report for yourself. I'll put the link down below. But here's what the executive summary says at the very beginning. It says, for almost 2 decades, survivors of abuse and other concerned Southern Baptists have been contacting the SBC, their executive committee, to report child molesters and other abusers who were in the pulpit or employed as church staff. And they made phone calls, mailed letters, sent emails, appeared at the SBC and the EC meetings. They held rallies and contacted the press, only to be met time and time again with resistance, stonewalling, and even outright hostility from some within the executive committee. Now, here's what went wrong according to the Guideposts report on this. There are 3 main things: the mishandling of abuse allegations and mistreatment of victims, the pattern of intimidation of victims or advocates, and resistance to sexual abuse reform initiatives. Now, before we get into this, I want to make something really clear here. I love Jesus, I love the Bible, I love the Southern Baptists. Just because the Southern Baptist Church is embroiled in this controversy doesn't mean we need to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but I think there's something for all of us to learn here, whether you're just a Christian or whether you're investigating Christianity and this is sort of putting a black mark on the whole thing, or whether you're a leader at church. I think there's something for all of us to learn. This is what wisdom is learning from someone else's mistakes. So let's talk about the first thing that went wrong, the mishandling of abuse allegations and the mistreatment of victims. The report says that over the years, the executive committee's response to sexual abuse allegations was largely driven by senior EC staff members, and their main concern was avoiding any potential liability for the Southern Baptist Convention, which is a real problem. That shouldn't be their main concern. Those who reported abuse were often ignored or told that the SBC had no power to take action. But the report does say that the SBC had spent time over the last 10 or 20 years compiling their own reports anytime there was a complaint. Here's what Guideposts said about that. Despite collecting these reports for more than 10 years, there's no indication that anyone took any action to ensure that the accused ministers were no longer in positions of power at SBC churches. The most recent list prepared by an EC staff member contained the names of 703 abusers, with 409 of them believed to be SBC affiliated at some point in time. Russell Moore wrote about this in an article on Christianity Today. He said not only was nothing done to stop these predators from continuing their hellish crimes, staff members were reportedly told not to even engage those asking about how to stop their child from being sexually violated by a minister. That's incredible. Rather than a database to protect sexual abuse victims, the report reveals that these leaders had a database to protect themselves. How many times do we have to see stories like this, whether it's the Southern Baptists or the Catholics or whoever it is, that spiritual leaders who are supposed to be protecting the flock are actually the one covering up some of these scandals? I think it's terrible and it just has to stop. Here's the second thing that went wrong. It was a pattern of intimidation of victims or advocates. The report reads, rather than focusing on these accused ministers, some of the EC leaders turned against the very people trying to shine a light on sexual abuse. The survivors, those persons who actually suffered at the hands of SBC clergy or SBC church staff or volunteers, who spoke out the most and who criticized the SBC's inaction, were denigrated as opportunistic, having a hidden agenda of lawsuits, wanting to burn things to the ground, and acting as a professional victim. Emily St. James talked about this in her article on Vox. She said the SBC's theological underpinnings will make elevating the voices of those accusing pastors of abuse difficult because it privileges the voices of those pastors over those of their parishioners, especially women parishioners. In short, once a charismatic man becomes the leader of an SBC church, it can be very hard to punish him in a meaningful way. Have we not learned this lesson by now? Look, if you are going to a church with a charismatic leader, I just want to make sure that you understand this has happened time and time and time again, that charismatic leader is still accountable to Jesus. And if you are that charismatic leader, if you are a pastor of a church, as I am, these words should be really sobering for us. We should take these words to heart and make sure not to weaponize our charisma or our place of leadership within the church. Here's the third thing that went wrong: resistance to sexual abuse reform initiatives. The report reads, over the past 20 years, various reform proposals have been brought to the EC. Nevertheless, although some proposals may not have been feasible, it is striking that many reform efforts were met with resistance, typically due, once again, to concerns over incurring legal liability. That's why Russell Moore said this at the very end of his article: that's more than a crisis. It's even more than just a crime. It's blasphemy. And anyone who cares about heaven ought to be mad as hell. I know I am, and here's why. This is what Jesus thinks about this whole thing. Matthew 18, it says, Jesus called a little child to him and put the child among them. And then he said, I tell you the truth, unless you turn from your sins and become like little children, you will never get into the kingdom of heaven. So anyone who becomes as humble as this little child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Since its inception, Christianity has protected children. Christianity has invited children in. That's Jesus's heart. So any Christian leader who's protecting the abuser at the expense of the child is going against the very heart of Jesus on the matter. And here's a more sobering part of this passage, verses 5 and 6. Jesus said, and anyone who welcomes a little child like this on my behalf is welcoming me. But if you cause one of these little ones who trusts in me to fall into sin, it would be better for you to have a large millstone tied around your neck and be drowned in the depths of the sea. Now, the Greek word there for causing a child to sin is actually not about them sinning. It's about causing them to stumble. And this is exactly what's happening. It's not just happening to our children. It's happening to seekers. It's happening to people who were in the church and now they're wondering. So many people are stumbling in their faith, not the least of which is the children. So many are stumbling in their faith when we as a church should be welcoming people in, especially the children. We need to learn from this most recent scandal in the Southern Baptist Convention. Let's do everything we can in the church to make sure it never happens again.